you know, it's applicable to more things, but like how you can move your cameras in a few different ways to like make things a little bit more realistic or a little bit easier. So the first thing I just want to touch on, does anybody know the difference between local space and world space in Maya? All right. What? All right, so I thought I went over this at some point. Maybe not. Deja vu. So if you have objects in Maya, this is like the weirdest channel box layout I've ever seen. What? Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to say world space is basically just when your objects are, like the translate, rotate values or whatever, are just basically going, what am I saying? Sorry. When the translate values are calculating the distance between your object and just the origin of the scene. So like 0, 0, 0, that is world space. So right now, this is telling me that my little sphere is 2.592 units away from the origin on the x-axis. If I move this, somewhere else, it's saying basically the coordinate points of this, again, in relation to, or the distance from the origin. Does that make sense for world space? Cool. So local space is when the object is being measured not from the distance to the origin, but to some other object. Usually it's some other object. So in this case, I'm just going to pull up my, what am I doing? My outliner. Dump that over there. All right, so if I take this sphere and parent it under my cylinder. So in this case, I'm just going to middle mouse button drag it up onto my cylinder. And you can see that it has now been placed under my cylinder. It is now a parent of said cylinder. You'll notice as I do that actually, I'm going to undo that really quick. I'm just going to zero out my sphere. So right now this is like sitting perfectly on the origin. And now I'm going to grab my sphere and again drag it under my cylinder. You'll notice that as soon as I do that, a translate x value is applied to that sphere. So this is basically because as soon as you parent something, it enters what's called local space, where again, instead of being measured as the distance from the origin, it's the distance to this particular cylinder that I have parented it under. Does that make sense? Cool. So it's just something to be aware of. So you notice that the cylinder itself is translated like 4.857 units to the left, and this is basically saying I'm 4.857 units away from it. So if I go and I move the cylinder around, it's going to take the circle because the circle is a child of that cylinder. But you'll notice so the cylinder values will change, but the sphere stays at 4.857, because we haven't actually moved this. If we move this in any direction, it's going to be, again, measuring the distance between the cylinder and not the origin. If we take this sphere, and I'm just going to do Shift-P to unparent it, you'll notice that the values change because it's, again, now measuring the distance between the object and the origin instead of the object and the cylinder. So if I, again, undo that so it's parented, different values, unparent it, different values again. That's pretty much object versus world space, or I'm sorry, object versus local space. Just good to be aware that it exists. Are there any questions about that? All right, cool. So the other thing I wanted to go over is that you can do sort of a weird little like baby camera rig almost with parenting. So just parenting stuff in the outliner. So if I go create cameras and I just like make a new camera, you can do something similar to the bouncing ball where we had like a group for the translate and the rotate and the scale. And again, you can do that with the camera as well to achieve something of sort of realistic way to manipulate the camera. So in this case, I'm just going to group it 4 times, and I'll just shift click on that to expand all of my little groups. So usually the first one is just going to be like a camera move group. So I'm just going to call this like cam move. And you can use this to like shift your whole camera around in the scene if you need it, to just like go to different locations. That's usually what you'd use the move group for. You can make a group for side-to-side movements, so stuff like, you know, not panning, but if you just needed it to like shift back and forth like this on a single axis, you can have a group for that. And then pan up, down, and tilt. So again, you can kind of use your camera and control things kind of in a similar way where we did with the ball. So in this case, like the tilt is just going to control basically only rotation. So I'm just going to go ahead. I don't really care about scale. You shouldn't really scale cameras. I'm just going to assume that no one's going to scale the camera. So like I could go through and I could lock the translate for the tilt group, since again, I really only care about the rotation functionality of that. And then for the pan, if I wanted to, I could lock the rotation of that, since I'm basically just going to be, you know, dragging it up and down, etc., etc. So if you wanted to, let me just like throw some random items in my scene. And again, I usually, a lot of times, will sort of ignore this, oftentimes when setting up a camera. But if I wanted to, you know, so I could go over and just be like, all right, here's just like the move group I'm going to use just for the initial positioning of like where the camera should be. And then I'm going to use these other groups that I just made to control the movement of the camera. So I could go through and I could say, I'm just going to keyframe on frame 1. What am I doing? Wrong place. I'm just going to keyframe the translation and then just shift it over to some other sort of arbitrary spot. And maybe key that again. And then I say maybe I want like a little bit of tilting in here. And you can actually I'm just going to like look through that camera. And also be aware, if you're looking through a camera and you have auto key turned on, if you move that camera, it has a tendency to actually like key. In this case, I'm just looking through the camera, so it's not. What am I saying? When you look through the camera, you're moving the camera itself, not all of these groups that it's in. So since I haven't set any keyframes on the camera itself, it's not going to key anything. But you can, so like I'm just going to set a keyframe on the camera itself and go to frame 60 and like move it around. You'll notice that it is actually setting more keyframes on that camera. So do be aware that, again, if you're moving your camera and you have keyframes on it with auto key turned on, it's going to just casually overwrite all of your nice camera movements that you've spent a bunch of time on. So just be aware of that. You can, by using this sort of like weird camera rig system, you can actually look through your camera and set all this back to 0. You can manipulate the positioning of the camera. Again, I can like change the translate Y, etc., and you can see that that is modifying the positioning of the camera. And you don't need to worry about like accidentally keying the camera itself. You can still move around, and it's not gonna key the camera. It will affect like how your rig looks, but it's not gonna like add weird keyframes onto things or like overwrite your keyframes. Does that make sense? Cool. But yeah, so basically you can, again, sort of use these if you want to go through and like add different effects to your camera and control it in a way that's like a little bit more real-worldy. And this is just like a really sort of wonky example, but again, you can do, you know, stuff like this. Again, personally, I very rarely use this method to do anything with cameras. I tend to just make a camera and key the camera itself because I think it's easier, and I also don't necessarily have a background in film. Somewhere where this would be helpful is, again, if you're trying to recreate like a specific camera setup of like a real-world camera for something like VFX or just because you like the effect. If you have information about that, how that camera is moving through space, it's like following a specific, you know, pre-built track or something around the character. This would be a pretty decent way to recreate that effect. So it's really good for stuff like that. Again, you guys can kind of use it if you want to. Not requiring you to use it, but it exists. And it's a little bit more real-worldy than just sort of being like, aha, I'm going to just sort of shift this camera around in space randomly. It can also help if you use this sort of rig to have a little bit more realistic camera motions. Because I guess I assume that most of you guys have like realized this already. But like it's really easy to do highly unnatural things in CG, whereas in the real world you're bound by, you know, physics and stuff. So setting it up like this closer to the real world helps you sort of make something that looks maybe a little bit more natural than just crazily like being able to shift your camera around through space. My hotkeys aren't working. In a way that would like not at all be physically possible. So that's just like a weird sort of aside about setting up like a little group for your camera. The other thing that, any questions about that before we completely move on to a different topic? All right. So kind of bouncing a little bit back into world space versus local space. So right now, I don't think I've talked really about constraints. I'm sure some of you guys are like familiar with at least some of them. But they're used really, really frequently in rigging to set up controllers for your rigs. Basically, it does a really, really similar thing to parenting. And there's different types of constraints, but it doesn't forcibly put your object in local space, which can be kind of nice. So in this case, I'm actually just going to go ahead and zero that out because it's kind of easy to see. Hide this. Okay. My eyes gone nuts. All right. So if you guys are looking for constraints, they are usually found in either the rigging, and they also have them in the animation menu. I'm just going to go to rigging. But basically what you want to do is just to set up a quick constraint, select the driver object, so the object that you want to like move the other one around, and then select the object that you want to be driven, so the object you want shifted around as the other one moves. So in this case, I'm going to say the cylinder is going to control the motion of the sphere. Go up to Constrain, and there's a few different types of constraints. Does anybody know any of the different types of constraints and what they do? Or like, I mean, they're listed here, but. All right. So basically, the Orient Constraint is probably like the most straightforward. This one is usually, it's only going to constrain the rotation. So you can move this around, and it's not going to take this. It's only going to look at the rotation of this. So I just set this up really quick. I'm just going to hit apply. So I just added an Orient Constraint. I pulled up this little box that was on the other screen. And you'll notice that once I've done that, it's actually added this like weird little node under my sphere saying, hey, there's an Orient Constraint on this sphere. So at this point, what I can do is if I, probably would have made sense to make this like a cube. Let me pull some vertices out of this so it's like obvious what's happening. Hooray. So you can see that as I rotate my cylinder, the rotation values are also being applied to the sphere. If I shift it around, nothing happens. And again, that's because of the type of constraint we set up. It's only looking at the orientation. So you'll notice if I do like 64 degrees of rotation on this, this also has 64 degrees of rotation on it. The other thing you want to be aware of with constraints is that whenever you constrain particular values, you'll notice that it kind of like blues out these values on the rotation. So I shouldn't be able to go through and edit these values. For some reason I can. But usually it'll actually lock the values so you are not able to edit the rotation of this constrained object. I've actually never seen it allow that before, so that's quite interesting that it did that. Either way. If you want to delete a constraint, you can just go in and manually select the node and just literally just hit delete and it'll get rid of it. The same thing if you have a keyframe set and you delete it, wherever your object is when you delete that constraint, it's going to leave it there. So in this case, I can just go back and zero out the rotation of that object. It's totally fine. So that's an Orient constraint. Any questions on sort of basic how constraints work or like, yep? Wait, sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
If you were to have two objects and animate them if they were constrained in some way, but you delete the constraint, would the animation still run normally?
No. It will delete all of your animations. Yeah, so that is a good point. Yeah, if you guys like animate something that is dependent on constraints, so like, you animated the orientation of this and it spun this around in a way that you liked, as soon as you delete that constraint, this stops spinning with that other object. So if you want something to be constrained, you just kind of like need to leave the constraint there. Yeah, that's a fair question. Anything else? Hmm?
If you like have the cylinder by default before you make the constraint, have like rotation of 90 degrees, and then I put it on,
Yes.
will it will it like be relative to that initial offset?
So yes and no. There's a setting for both. So depending on what you need, yeah, that's also a good question. So right now, yeah. So I've rotated my cylinder. It has a rotation. I'm going to grab my cylinder, so my driver object, and again, just shift select my driven. And right now, so with my settings just sort of all by default, the setting in question is going to be maintain offset. So with that checked off, if I apply this, it's going to basically, again, reorient this so that it has the same matching rotation of this cylinder. If I undo that and I turn on maintain offset and hit apply, it's going to leave the rotation of this at 0, but then if I rotate this, it's still going to like tack on whatever additional rotation that is. So there's like, I don't use this so much for Orient constraints, but I use it a lot for transform constraints. I'll show you guys how you can use constraints to like have a really badly modeled hand picking up just like a ball or something like that. And you can kind of do that with maintain offset. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sweet. Any other questions? Huzzah. All right. So other types of constraints. Zero all this stuff out. So that was an Orient constraint. And again, Orient constraints are for the rotation. Scale constraint is pretty much the same thing. It's for scale. I'm not really going to go through and demo that one. Point constraint is translation. So that's going to be, again, if I apply this, you can see this one is modifying the translate values of my object. And since I have not selected maintain offset, it has gone through and just snapped my weird spiky sphere into the middle of my cylinder. If I move my cylinder, it's going to take the sphere with it. I'm going to undo that. So if you wanted this to kind of follow along without being snapped into the center, again, you can just go through and click maintain offset, apply that, and now when I shift this around, it's going to drag my sphere with it. I can also, since this is only looking at the translate values, I can rotate this as much as my little heart desires, and it's not going to do anything to the sphere. So that is a point constraint. Any questions on that? Cool. So if you ever need an object to follow both the translation and the rotation, and you want to constrain both, you can do two things. You can make a separate point and orient constraint, so you can see that the sphere now has two different constraints on it. So if I move this around, it's going to drag it with me. If I rotate it, it's going to rotate this. And there's another option which is usually better to use if possible. Sometimes if you get it like doesn't work and it's just like casually broken, so I'll just make two constraints. They work the same. But there's the parent constraint. And that is for both translation and rotation. Not scale, just translation and rotation. And that's a parent constraint. So if you do maintain offset, it has pretty much the same options. You can also go through, if you want, for the constraint axes. And you can do this for any of the other ones too. I just usually do it for constraint, or for parent constraints. And you can basically turn off the translate and rotate values for certain axes. But really quick, I'm just going to set the default one up. So you can see we have one parent constraint node. If I move this around, it's going to drag my, my sphere. And if I rotate it, in this case, it behaves a little bit differently, where it's actually dragging my sphere around the object instead of going, like the single Orient constraint would basically just shift the object in place. So this one does behave like slightly differently, but again, it's pretty much depending on what you need, you can set these up differently. So if you wanted your object to stay in place, like it might make more sense to use an Orient Constraint. Does that make sense? Cool. Honestly, with constraints, if one doesn't work, try either fiddling with the way it works or just trying a different one entirely. Especially when you get into complex rigging, like I said, sometimes they just randomly break for no apparent reason. So again, I did mention you can like turn off some of the functionality. So if I wanted to basically turn off rotation entirely and use the parent constraint just like a point constraint for only translation, I'll just uncheck the rotate box and do apply. And you can see that it's actually only gone through and constrained the translation, which sometimes I'll do, like, again, if an Orient constraint is broken, you can use a parent constraint just like an Orient constraint, and it kind of functions the same way. You can also go through, if you want, and select specific axes. So if I want, like, the X and the Z for the translate and only the Y for the rotate, I can apply that, and it's only going to constrain those particular values. So in this case, like I can move this, left or right or back, and it's going to take the sphere with it. If I try to move it up, I haven't constrained the y-axis of the translate, so it's just going to leave that in place. That's more or less the basic types of constraints. I'll show you guys like a few examples of how to use them in helpful ways in like 2 seconds, but are there any questions on that before we go on? All right, cool. So the other thing that you can do is, let me make an ugly prism. The other thing you can do is actually kind of like an addition onto that, I guess. You can actually have multiple objects driving a single object. So I'll just like show you how to set that up and then show you how to do like a really sketchy picking up a ball animation. But basically, you want to grab both of the objects you want to be drivers, so in this case my sad cone and my cylinder, and then select the object you want driven, and go up and do a constrain just like you normally would. I'm just going to do a regular parent constrain with all of these checked on. And I'm going to do... All right, I'm going to do this for now. So you can see that we have still one parent constraint just under the sphere, and you'll notice that if I move the cylinder around, this is still following it, but not as aggressively. Like you can see, I can get it like way closer. It's not staying equidistant as it was before. If I grab this, I can also shift it around. So this is right now being affected by both of these objects. So you can do this with as many objects as you want. You could have like 100 objects driving this one thing if you wanted to. I've never had a reason to do that, but you could if you wanted to. And there's ways you can actually control the strength of, if you didn't want them to be equally controlling over this object, you can control that. If you go and click on this parent constraint node, in your channel box, you'll see a bunch of different, there's like some stuff that I honestly usually don't worry about, like these top 3. But what these at the bottom are basically saying, here's the weight of your parent constraints to, in this case, the cylinder and the cone. So basically how much influence do you want these objects to have over your object. And for some reason, for the life of me, I can't figure out why they have set this up the way they have. But right now, it's both of these values are at 1. So basically saying they have like, normally I would interpret that as like full control over the object. But for some reason, like if I could set this to 10 so the cone has more weight, and you can see that it's sort of dragging the object closer to that cone. If I set this to 40, it gets a little bit closer. The weird thing, like if you want this to only follow the cone, so like right now, I can move this and you can see that it has like barely any influence on it, but it's still moving the object. If I wanted that to be turned off completely, I would have to go in and set the cylinder weight to 0. So now if I move this, it does nothing, and this follows this cone completely. Does that make sense? Cool. It's a little weird. Like I don't understand like why they would let you enter values of like 7,000 in this, and it just sort of like weights it proportionally somehow. And I'm just like, personally, I like to just try to keep it values of 0 and 1. So I'm like 0.5 for both of these does the exact same thing functionally as values of 1 and 1 or values of 7,000 and 7,000. it's just like a little bit of a weird system. But this basically restores it to what it was originally. So I like to keep that, again, as values of like either like decimals that all sort of add up to 1 or like something adding up to 10, just because I think it makes my life easier in the way that I like look at it and understand what's happening. So that is having two different objects drive the motion of a single object. Does that make sense? Cool. So practically speaking, like why would you want to use that? What you can do is set up, I promised you a bad, sad, ugly arm rig, and that is what I'm about to deliver to you. So I'm just going to grab this and shift the pivot down and be like, look, we have a really depressing functional arm looking thing. I didn't promise anything nice for that. All right. So I'm just going to go through and be like, here's my super derpy little arm, and cool. And then I'm just going to make another like weird little ball that's going to like be picked up by this object. So what you want to do, and actually I should really quick, I guess, mention, so there's a strange thing. So I'm going to show you, you can modify the weights of the constraint even when there's only one driving object. So I'm just going to set up the constraint, again, like what I did previously with the cylinder driving the sphere. I'll just do a regular parent constraint again. So if I go in and click in that constraint, right now the weight of the cylinder is set to 1. If I set this, so I can shift this around, be like, haha. I'll go in and I'll set that weight to 0. And you can see that it actually snaps the ball back into its original position. And if I can move the cylinder around, and it doesn't matter. It's not gonna take this with it. So for a weird point of sort of demonstration, I'm going to key this weight at 0 and just go to frame 25 and then key it again at 1. And I should also move this around. So I'm just going to add some random keyframes onto that. So you can see it does kind of a weird thing where as soon as the weight of this constraint is not 0, it starts following the object, and it makes this like weird snappy movement. So if you ever want to kind of get around that or like have more control over where your object is, you have to add an extra just like null group. So if I just add, it's a little bit weird. I'll go over this again. So basically I'm going to have two objects driving this. So in this case, the cylinder, and then I'm going to select this weird empty group that I've made, and then the sphere. And basically what that allows you to do, it's like a hacky workaround, but it allows you more control over like that jittery motion that was happening when I keyed between the different values of things. Because again, Maya sets this up a little strange, and it's not like any kind of recognizable fraction. It's just pretty much, is there weight on this object, or is it 0? If it's 0, it's not going to follow it. If there's any weight, it's going to follow it a lot. So adding this null group in there kind of allows you to go in and, again, you can set all the keyframes. So I'm just going to key, in this case, I'll turn the constraint off for the cylinder. So you can see that now as this weight is going from, so from when it's going from 1 where it like should follow the cylinder, and it's going down to 0, it's a little bit more of like a smooth transition at least. And it's still kind of like following the cylinder and then bouncing back, trying to get back to this null group here. But we do at least have, again, control over the smoothness of that, and we can kind of fudge it and make it a little bit of a better transition with that null group, if that makes sense. So I mostly brought that up because I'm going to do something again with the null groups when we pick up this ball. But does that like kind of make sense? All right. Constraints are a bit weird. Yeah. So, okay, we're going to do something similar. So in this case, I'm just going to make another null group. And I'm going to just make a horrible animation for this arm coming down and grabbing the ball. Ooh, that looks delightful. Double transformations, probably. All right, so, shoot. Go to like frame 23, do that, and then do, that is incredibly questionable. All right, well, I actually have no idea why it's doing that. It's weird. I'm just going to ignore it for now. And then maybe back up. So we have this like really, really depressing animation. So like arm's going to come down, grab the ball, and then move back up into place. So what we're going to do is set up a few constraints so that we can control without having to do something where you have like 8 versions of this ball in the scene and like hiding them. We can control the ball being attached to this arm, basically. So again, I've created a null group that's just, currently it's just sitting in the middle of the ball itself. And that's fine. That's where I'm going to leave it for this. And then I have the silly arm cylinder that I made. So I'm going to grab the arm cylinder, the null group, and then the ball, because the ball is what I want moved. It's what I grabbed last. And I'm going to do a constrain. I'm going to do a parent constrain, and I'm going to actually turn off maintain offset. So in this case, actually, I'll do both versions. So in this case, I'm going to start with maintain offset turned off. So basically what's going to happen is it's going to forcibly drag the ball either back to the null group or onto the arm. I'm going to apply that and see what happens. And in this case, it's kind of done what you might have guessed it would done, which is drag the ball halfway between the null group and the arm. So in this case, if we scrub through our animation, you can see that the ball is kind of moving with the arm because that's basically what we're telling it to do right now. If I go in and I look at the parent constraint, what I'm going to do is, does anybody have any guesses on like what I would do for this? All right. Right. Yeah, so pretty much like when you, I think I said, so like should make contact at like frame 23, I think. So I'm basically going to go through on frame 23 and say, all right, I want the null group to have, yes, good, a weight of 0, and the cylinder to have a weight of 1. Right before that, I want it to not be attached to the cylinder at all, and I want it to be completely attached to the null group. So right now we have it, and it comes down, and it like touches the ball, and then the ball like snaps up to a really horrible location. So this is one of those things where it's like I set the constraint up incorrectly. I should have checked maintain offset when I created the constraint, but I forgot because I'm a dingus. So in this case, usually what I do is just go through and I'll just delete the constraint and reset it up because it takes like 5 seconds. So I'm going to turn on maintain offset, and again, just grab my cylinder, my null group, and then my sphere, and do apply. And now it pretty much kind of behaves like it did before, except it's not snapping the sphere into the little arm here. So what this allows me to do is, again, I'm going to go through and do the exact same thing. So on frame 23, I want it to stop following the null group and start following the cylinder. So I'm going to set cylinder weight to 1, null group value to 0, I'll key selected. And right before that, I'm going to set the cylinder weight to 0 and the null group to 1 because I want it to not follow the arm. So what this should give us, yes, good. Yeah, constraints are like a little funky. So basically this gives us a different type of snapping, where instead of snapping to the origin of the object, it's snapping back to the original distance from the object. So there's another silly workaround for stuff like that. And that is actually, and it's not a super fantastic workaround, but if you need to be able to control, so if I need to be able to like control the location of this object, again, for some reason, I have literally never seen it actually allow me to modify the translation with a constraint on it, ever. So that like is very strange to me that it's letting me do that. It's apparently even letting me key that, which is really weird. But that does seem to, as soon as I key that, it looks like it kind of breaks the constraint, so I wouldn't really do that. All right, so what I'm going to do is just go back. I'll delete this constraint. And usually if you're going to set up some kind of constraint or similar structure, what you want to do is, again, make another group for this. So I'm going to just add the sphere into a group, and I'm going to constrain the group itself. So again, grab cylinder, grab null group, cylinder, null group, and then the group containing the ball, not the ball itself. And then do another constrain. And you can do maintain offset or not. They're both going to, in this case, have like a little bit of weird snapping stuff happening. And I'm just going to apply that. And then once again, go through on frame 23 and just like keyframe the constraint. Great. So now what we have is pretty much what we had last time. The difference here is that we can now at least control the movement of the ball. So in this case, I happen to know that it starts on the origin. So I'm going to set a keyframe, and this is on the sphere itself, on the translate values. And then on frame 23, I'm just going to press and hold X, that's grid snapping, and I'm just going to snap it back to the origin, and that should be keyed. So you'll notice that like now it's not shifting places, it's shifting rotation a bit, so I'd have to like counter key against that, and maybe rotate this back into something, yes, because I didn't key that. So I have to shift that back into a position that's not gonna like have really obvious like weird position snapping. But you can see that now we kind of have something where like the arm comes down, grabs the ball, and it picks it up. And you can just sort of set that up as many times as you need with as many different objects as you need. And that's all just done by keying the constraint. So if you wanted to have balls like thrown back and forth between different people, you could constrain the ball to like each one of their hands and key the weight so it bounces back and forth between them. So that was like kind of a weird roundabout way to set that up, but does anyone have any questions on what I just did there? All right. So this might not be like super necessary for the assignment this week, but it is good to know, I guess, that you can do this kind of stuff in case you need to do it for your finals. The other thing you can use constraints for is constraining cameras to certain objects. So instead of a ball, like if this was a camera you wanted following a specific character, you could again set that up so that it was constrained to maybe some different objects, and then you could, have it follow different objects without having to like manually key it by the side of the character. So imagine you had, someone walking down the street and you wanted to add like a little bit of camera shake. You'd only have to worry about the camera shake, and the camera would sort of automatically follow the person. So that way you could use constraints for this week's stuff. And you'll also notice that this is perhaps like a little bit of a weird example. That if I grab the cylinder and just really quick constrain it to the sphere, you will notice that it doesn't change. This is still using world space, right? So if we parented this to the cylinder, it would have some like crazy high translation values since it's so far away from this, but with a constraint, it's still operating under world space where everything is measured from distance to the origin. It's not like super relevant, but again, good to be aware that that is what is happening with constraints. Does that make sense? Cool. All right, the other thing that you can use constraints for, and this is like just a really, really eccentric, strange little demo. I'm gonna make like the world's shoddiest eyeball. It's gonna be amazing. There is one type of constraint that I didn't mention, and it is a glorious constraint for stuff like eyes. So I just set up, again, a really sketchy looking eyeball. And you can set up what is called an Aim Constraint. So that is basically just going to be me. Let me throw like a cube in front of these eyes. So I'm going to grab my cube and then you have to do one eye at a time, which is kind of a pain, but grab your cube, grab your eye, do constrain, and again, we just want to do an Aim Constraint. So usually for these, I will turn on maintain offset. I'm going to show you what happens if you don't. But this is basically, all right. Sometimes it does just like snap it to really stupid rotations. Like it's decided that 79 degrees is a reasonable direction to point this object, which is kind of strange. All right, yeah, that's really weird. So So I've actually never really had that be a huge issue before, but basically what was happening was it was saying, I want to look, I want the aim vector is like the axis that it wants to point, basically. So it was saying I want the x-axis to point up, but this is currently set up to be looking along the y-axis. Don't worry too much about that. That's just like what I did there. I was basically just saying the y-axis should point at this and not the x. So again, you can see that as soon as I set up that constraint, the eyeballs start pointing towards this cube. So I can move this around and the eyeballs are going to follow it. So this is a really great way to set up like eyeball controllers if you have eyes on a character ever. Usually I will turn on maintain offset because I find it incredibly disorienting when your characters get like automatically cross-eyed. So it helps, maintain offset in this case helps to compensate if your controller is not perfectly centered over that eyeball. But that's pretty much an aim constraint. Honestly, they're really fun. If I wanted to, I could like make a different cube and constrain that to this eye so that I could operate each eyeball independently, do some really uncomfortable effects with this. And it seems as though I've actually forgotten to take the other constraint off, so it's gone through, and you can see if you constrain the same object twice, it'll just add weight in there. But yeah, that's pretty much an aim constraint. Good for stuff like pointing fingers. You can use it for like heads turning. If there's like something flying across your sheet, you can have everyone go, ha, and like follow it. But yeah. So that is basically constraints. Does anybody have any questions about that? All right. So skipping on to another thing that will be probably related to your assignment this week is motion paths. And I know some of you guys like know about these already because you've just mentioned you use them in your assignments. But basically you can move an object or a camera along a specific curve. So what I'm going to do is just go into my create curve tool and just do like a CV curve tool. I'll make some kind of completely arbitrary shape. Hooray. And then I'm just going to give this like a little bit of bend or something so it's more interesting. Great. Super terrifying looking. And then I'm just going to make, say, a little cone because I feel like cones are fairly easy to see which way they're pointing. And again, I mean, you can, if you set this to be a motion path, you can basically have this little triangle thing follow this curve. So if I grab, I always set this up the wrong way. What is it? All right. Then you grab your curve and then your object. And this is under the animation menu. You can go to Constrain and Motion Paths. So basically, again, if you have an object selected and a curve, you can just do attach to motion path. There's a few other settings that you can play with to get the functionality that you need. And you can see that once I apply that, it basically snaps this little cone thing I made to my motion path. So if I scrub through my timeline, you can see that this is following along the path. And it is actually, I'll go back and like play with the settings again. It's doing kind of like a weird thing where I meant it to point forward. But you can see that it's following the path and it kind of is curving. Like as it goes over this arc, it's sort of, changing the rotation of the object to sort of match it along that curve. So hopefully you can see where something like this would be really convenient for doing like a roller coaster animation or something like that. So I'm just going to go through and see what happens. So front axis, it looks like is the X. And I would like the front of this cone to be like point forward, just going along this curve. So I'm going to see what happens if I set it to Y. All right. And you can see that it's just changed the direction that this is pointing when it's first attached to the curve. So now if I scrub through, you can see really, really clearly that it is rotating this object, again, along the path of the curve. Any questions about just like how to set up a motion path? All right. So you can use this again with cameras if you want to like have a camera go along a motion path. To be honest, I have never functionally used a motion path for anything. I like understand how they work, and I just don't really use them for that much. But you can go through and, where is it? Hang on. 5 seconds. Start end. Yeah, so if you want to, you can control a few different things with the motion path. So right now it's just set for time range. When you set this to time slider, it's basically going to automatically put a keyframe on the first frame. Oh, is it a question? Oh, okay. But yeah, so you can set a keyframe on the first frame, and then it's on whatever your time slider is at. So in my case, 120 is when it's going to hit the end of that curve. So if I go through and I set this to like 180 frames, you can see that it's still just sort of stopping at 120. If you want to control either when it starts or, in this case, when it starts and ends, you can select these different options and then manually plug in when you want your object to start moving. But yeah, that was pretty much my thought. What was your question?
So one thing I tried to use the motion path for was the visualize feature, and it kind of makes
Oh, yeah.
the object along it.
Yeah, ghosting.
Is there a way to make the instances as geometry? Because one thing I was trying to make was
Right.
like a chain.
Ew. You can do that with
That was
Mash.
the way people said to do it, but then I couldn't really like adjust individual chains because they were all part of the initial object.
Right. So honestly, so you're talking about ghosting, and I'm actually going to go over that in a few minutes, but I've not tried to find a way where I could take that and make it physical objects. But you could do that also really, really easily with Mash. Yeah, so that's probably how I would do it, but yeah. All right, so any questions on motion path so far? All right. If you want to go in and say, well, maybe I want this to like speed up and slow down at specific points. You can go in to your object itself, so like the P cone that I've made, and under inputs in the channel box, it should have one for motion path. And I find this to be incredibly awkward to control, kind of like the weights on the constraints. But basically, U value is the position on the curve or like along the motion path. And I always sort of interpreted this as like percentage along the path. So at frame 54, it's like 0.4% down, or like it's 40% along the curve, if that makes sense. So if I scrub down, you'll notice the very end of the curve is like 1. So if I go through and I say maybe set a keyframe, and it's automatically keyed, so like frame 1, it's at U value of 0, and frame 20, it's at a U value of 1. So that's like the automatic thing that it just sets up when it makes the motion path. And then again, you can control by manually manipulating this value where your object is on the path at any given time. So personally, I kind of like scrubbing through this value, which sometimes works significantly better than others. But doing that, you can sort of control, again, so I have it going a little bit faster at the beginning, and then it stops, and it actually bounces back, and then it starts going forward again. So that's more or less how you control the positioning on the curve. You can also look and you can key like the front twist, which is basically you can kind of see the cone is just like rotating, up twist, etc. So these are all things that you can key as you are dragging this along the curve to achieve, whatever kind of customized motion you want. In this case, like if this were a camera, being able to control like the up twist and the side twist would be nice sort of for panning to make sure that it's, as if you're going along this crazy curve and like trying to focus on something on the origin, it would kind of go through and continue looking at that one spot. Does that make sense? All right. So the other thing that you can do, which is really weird, I'm actually just gonna like set up a really quickie little camera. So this is basically a version with a camera rig. So I'm gonna add a group to that camera, and I'm going to select my curve, select my group, and again, go to Constrain, Motion Paths, and Attach Motion Path. And see how this snaps. Very awkward snapping. All right, I'm gonna try the x-axis again. And usually I will just sort of go through and click on things until it behaves in the way that I expect. So in this case, my camera is at least now pointing along my curve. I'm going to call that good. So if I go through and I look into that camera and I scrub through, you can see that it is sort of swinging me through space. And usually I find it is good if you're doing, again, for like a roller coaster or something like this, add a little bit of extra motion to that camera, because sometimes it gets real weird looking if it's just doing nothing but following that curve. And that's like, there's no other motion at all. So what I'm going to do really quick is just throw in a cube on the origin. And since I have this camera in a group, I can control it separately. And what I can actually do is go through and take my cube and then grab my camera and set up a constraint. So I basically want my camera to be looking at this cube at all times. So if I do a constrain and just do an aim constraint, let's see what happens if I turn off maintain offset. So cube, and again, I'll probably need to like play with some of these settings, but you can see my camera is not looking at the cube at all. So again, I probably need to play with some of these numbers for the aim vector. And I did mention I usually just try settings until something usually works, which is not the most scientific of methods, but it is. There we go. All right, so now it's pointing the correct direction. It's just backwards. So I'm going to, the offset is like if you want like rotational offset to this aim. So I'm just going to see what happens if I plug in 180 degrees on this offset, and that does bad things. Anyway, all right, this is very, very strange little demo. Say again? That is actually a very interesting question. I've never tried that before, but that does sound like a thing that should work. Maybe not. Actually, yes, it did. Cool. Awesome. Thank you for suggesting that. I have learned a thing today. Cool. So now theoretically, I'm very excited about that. So theoretically what should happen now as I move along this is we have a camera that is, again, moving through space and only looking at this cube. So it's like they can be pretty handy, I guess. I've just never personally had cause to use motion paths, but that is basically how to use them. Any questions on that? All right. So I'm going to go back to my perspective camera and just turn off the camera and the cone. All right, so I did say I was going to go over ghosting really quick, and it is kind of a cool visual representation of like what's happening with your frame. So if I select my object and go to visualize, ghost selected, usually I don't play with the preferences, so I'm just going to hit apply. But you can see that the object is actually showing me basically its position in the next few frames of where it is. So as I go along this motion path, you can see, again, so like right now we're on frame 19, so here's my object. This would be like frame 18, 17, 16, etc. This would be 20, 21, etc. So it is a really interesting way to sort of scrub through your animations, and you can see, if I scrub through at the beginning, you can see as these space themselves out, it's denoting that, again, this is like faster motion than it was when the frame was at, or when the cone was at frame 1. So it can be a really interesting way to sort of preview your animations and get a visual of like what is actually happening and how these are moving through space on different frames. And again, there are like other settings. So if I'm just gonna go, just override it. So you can do like custom frames and custom frame steps. So this would be like, basically I only want the ghosting to appear on frame 1, 10, and 20. And then no matter where I am on the time slider, it's only going to display those. Usually what I end up doing is like custom frame steps, which is kind of like render frames a little bit. So I can say I want more previews before the frame. I'll apply that, and you can see that it's displaying significantly more of these little like ghosty previews. I could also set my step size to like 5. So it's still showing me a bunch of previews. It's just, instead of showing me every single frame, it's showing me every 5th frame. But that's honestly like more or less ghosting. It's just like kind of a nice visual aid. And there's some stuff with like rigging that you can do later on with it to like help you get nice transitions. But it exists, and you can do kind of cool stuff with it. Any questions on ghosting? All right. If you ever want to unghost an object, just select it and do visualize and unghost selected, and then it will just get rid of all those like weird previews. For motion paths, you can also, again, find the controls for it in the inputs of the object that is shifting along the curve. And you can go through and move any of these keyframes like you normally would. Other cool thing that I don't think I like actually demoed, but no matter where you move this curve, it's going to basically control your object along it. So in this case, I'm stretching it far enough where it's actually moving the object on the curve, but it's going to continue to follow that curve. So wherever you put the curve, you can move it, and it's just like kind of a nice modular way to do stuff where, again, if you're setting up like a camera, like I did with that, with the Aim Constraint, you can really easily change its path through space without needing to worry about the rotation. Whereas if you keyed it manually, you would have to like shift it and then like change the rotation for a few frames to get it to continue pointing at that curve. But yeah, that's pretty much that. So that's actually all I had for you guys today. Are there any questions about anything I showed you, assignments, Maya exploding for no apparent reason? All right, cool. If that is the case, don't forget, assignment is due next week, but there is no class next week. So I will, make some videos or any relevant stuff that you guys need and send those out. Please do actually watch them at some point because there's also another assignment due week 5 when we come back. Apart from that, farewell. Have a lovely Monday.